Hi people, welcome to Chess 24/7, and this is the fifth installment in the series of chess imbalances, and today's video is all about the pawn structure. So this is my favorite topic in the book because in my lot of games I was defeated because I had a very poor pawn structure, and I'm sure you must have been defeated, and if not, that's great. But if you want to improve a game or if you want to capitalize your opponent's weakness, you should definitely watch this video, because this video contains all the information about what is a weakness, how you should defend it, and how you should attack it, and how you should avoid creating weakness, or how you can create weakness in your opponent's camp. So with that said, let's get started. Okay, so if you ask an amateur player like you and me or anybody else what he thinks of when you say hanging, doubled, backward or isolated pawns, the most likely response will be a weakness. Unfortunately, most amateurs don't know how to go after the pawn weaknesses, much preferring the thrill of a king hunt. The other side of the story follows the same pattern. If the amateur gets these so-called weaknesses, he usually panics because he is not aware of the dynamic potential inherent in all these structures. The simple truth is it's impossible to label anything in chess as always being weak. In this video, I'll try to exemplify when to punish the existence of these pawns and when to welcome them in your own position. So what Jeremy has done for this topic is he has labeled different pawns and different pawn structures such as double pawns, isolated pawns, and has provided the negative and positive aspect of each of them. So we'll go with the first structure, that is double pawns. The negative aspect of double pawns is that the doubling of pawns reduces their flexibility and at times leave one or both of them vulnerable to attack, though it's usually the lead pawn that is weaker. I'll show you an example. In the following position, white's c pawn are doubled. Though the pawn on c3 is very safe, but the guy on c4 is further advanced and thus is vulnerable to attack, and white will try to dominate the game or will try to win this pawn and would try to make white busy in protecting the pawn on c4. And it's all because that the c4 pawn is, the pawns on c5 are doubled, and the c4 pawn, which is the lead pawn, is vulnerable to attack. And the positive aspect of double pawns is that the doubling of pawns lead to extra open files for your rook and increased square control. For example, in the following position, white has played bishop to e3. And it's wise for white to allow his pawns to be doubled. Actually, white would love black to capture on e3, because after black captures on e3, pawn captures on e3, white gets an increased control of d4 square and f4 square, and immediately creates a file which is open for his rook, since e4 is solidly guarded by a pawn, and since the e3 pawn is quite safe, so white suffers no negative consequences from the doubling of the pawns in this position. The next pawn structure is isolated pawns, and isolated pawns by definition means any individual pawn which is not guarded by any other pawn or is isolated and has to be protected by minor pieces or big pieces. For example, in the following position, white can bring his whole army and could try to win the pawn on c6. He could place a rook on the c file, could even bring his queen, could even bring his knight, and try to keep black busy in protection of the c6 pawn and can win the pawn eventually. Although the positive aspect of isolated pawn is that the creation of an isolated pawn may bestow upon its owner the use of a half open file. For example, in the following example, if white plays bishop takes c5, then he could the black side would capture the bishop on c5 with his queen or with his knight, but he captures it with the pawn. And yes, the pawn on c5 is now isolated, but it is protected and is on a very semi-open file, thus is not weak. Although instead, black now has opened the b file and can attack the b2 pawn. The next pawn structure is backward pawns. Backward pawns are the pawns which are in the end of pawn chain and are quite vulnerable or exposed to the attack by the opponent. A negative aspect of backward pawn is By the way, a backward pawn is only weak if it's sitting on an open file and it's unable to advance. The slide playing against the backward pawn should strive to control the square directly in front of it, turning into an immobile target. Since the square cannot be defended by a pawn, one way to do is to exchange all the pieces that defend this square. I'll exemplify it. In the following position, white will play to increase his control over the d5 square by knight d5 or c2 to c3 or even knight a3, c2 to c3, and if necessary g2 to g3, followed by bishop g2. If white could exchange of black's c8 bishop and knight, the first player would have permanent control over the d5 square. The positive aspect of a backward pawn is that it acts as a guard to more advanced pawn to the side of it. The advanced pawn can block enemy pieces and can control important squares. The backward pawn cannot be considered a bad thing if the square in front of it is well defended. For example, in the following position, white can play knight to d5, and after knight takes d5, pawn takes d5. In this position, the d6 pawn, which defends the important e5 pawn, is well defended and is not really a weakness in fact at all. Black's active pieces and pressure on e4 gives the second player the advantage. The next structure is the hanging pawns. The negative side of these hanging pawns are that this kind of structure can be weak if the other side is able to circumvent any dynamic advance of the pawn duo, and since the pawns would be then immobile, drain the power of all his pieces against them. For example, in the following position, white has created a strong pressure against d5 pawn and there is nothing black can do to save it. For example, let's say after knight to e4 and knight takes d5, bishop takes d5 and bishop takes e4, and here white has lost his pawn duo because it was a hanging pawn. Albeit the positive aspect of hanging pawns are that the traditional hanging pawn on c5 and d5 or c4 and d4, if white has them, control many important central squares and give their owners an advantage in territory, and also offers play on half open b file and c file. Because, for example, in the diagram, in the following position, black has hanging pawns are well defended and give him extra space, control of the center, and strong play down the b file. Since black threatens to play queen b4, white takes steps to prevent it. Next type of pawn structure is pass pawns. The negative side of pass pawns is that a protected pass pawn is not always an advantage, though most players think it is. If the square in front of the pawn can be controlled by the other side, then the pawn is stopped in its track and becomes a non-factor for a long time. Even worse, if this square falls to a knight, then the horse will radiate power on the neighboring squares and pawns. For example, in the following position, black knight on d6 prevents the enemy pass pawns from going anywhere. It also eyes b5, b7, c8, e8, f7 and f5, aside from attacking the white pawns on c4 and e4. Under normal circumstances, black knight wouldn't be able to stay on d6 since white's pressure on the d file would make it run away. However, in this case, the d5 pawn is acting like a traitor, blocking its own pieces. With white's pawn stopped, the active black queen majority shows itself to be more valuable. However, the positive side of a pass pawn is very strong if its owner has play elsewhere. Then it can be used as an endgame in challenge. A pass pawn is also strong if the square in front of it is cleared for pawns to advance. As can be seen, when a pass pawn exists, the square in front of it becomes the most important square on the board. Whoever owns this square dominates the game, so great energy and imagination must be demonstrated by both sides if they want to wrest control of this critical point. For example, in the following position, black is in big trouble since he does not have the control of the square in front of the pass pawn. White plays d6 followed by d7, and the whole black army will be forced to run before the pawn smite. So remember, so-called weak pawns are only weak if you can seriously attack them or make use of the weak squares that may come with them. So this is the end of this video. I hope you found it interesting, instructive, and yeah, see you in my next video. Till then, good day, goodbye, tada.